If you've ever changed your answer just to avoid disappointing someone, agreed with something you didn't actually believe, or felt a wave of anxiety simply waiting to see how someone reacted to you, this video is for you. Stopping the need to seek everyone's approval isn't about becoming cold or arrogant, or no longer caring what anyone thinks. It's about training your mind to locate its own sense of worth from the inside, instead of constantly borrowing it from whoever happens to be standing in front of you. Imagine moving through your day without that quiet background hum of wondering if you said the right thing, if you looked good enough, if the people around you approve. What if you could make a decision and simply stand behind it without needing a dozen people to nod along first? That kind of steadiness isn't a personality trait some people are lucky enough to be born with. It's a set of simple, repeatable habits that anyone can learn. In this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly how to build that kind of unshakable self-respect, step by step. These aren't abstract ideas or feel-good slogans. They're practical shifts you can start using today, in your next conversation, your next decision, your next moment of hesitation. You'll learn how to notice the approval habit the second it activates, how to stop outsourcing your worth to other people's opinions, how to set boundaries without asking permission first, and how to build a version of confidence that doesn't collapse the moment someone disagrees with you. By the end of this, you'll understand why the calmest, most respected people in any room are rarely the ones chasing approval. They're the ones who already gave it to themselves. So stay with me, and let's start building that unshakable self-respect right now. Before we get into the specific steps, it helps to understand why this pattern is so common in the first place. Nobody wakes up one day and decides to start seeking everyone's approval. It develops gradually, often starting in childhood, where approval from parents, teachers, and peers genuinely did carry real consequences. A child who displeased the wrong person could face real tangible costs. And the nervous system learned, quite reasonably at the time, to scan constantly for signs of disapproval and adjust behavior accordingly to avoid it. The problem is that this system, built for a specific stage of life with specific real stakes, often keeps running unchanged into adulthood, where the actual stakes of a stranger's mild disapproval or a co-worker's neutral reaction are considerably lower. Yet the internal alarm continues sounding at full volume regardless. This means the approval-seeking habit isn't a character flaw or a sign of weakness. It's an outdated survival strategy, still running long after the original conditions that made it necessary have changed. Recognizing this reframes the entire project. You're not fixing something broken about your character. You're updating an old system that once served you well, and now, quite understandably, needs some genuine recalibration to match the actual world you're living in today. It's also worth naming that this recalibration doesn't happen through insight alone, no matter how clear or convincing that insight feels while you're hearing it. Understanding a pattern intellectually and actually shifting it in daily life are two different things, separated by consistent practice over time. You might finish this video feeling completely convinced by everything covered and still find yourself seeking approval reflexively the very next day. This gap between understanding and behavior isn't a sign that the ideas were wrong or that you're somehow uniquely resistant to change. It's simply the normal expected distance between learning something new and actually rewiring a pattern that's been running on autopilot for years, sometimes decades. The 12 shifts covered in this video are designed to close that gap gradually through specific, repeatable practices rather than through willpower or motivation alone, both of which tend to fade considerably faster than an actual rebuilt habit does. Think of this less as a single video that changes everything after one viewing, and more as a reference you might genuinely benefit from returning to multiple times as different chapters become more relevant at different points, depending on which specific pattern is showing up most strongly in your life during that particular season. Chapter 1. Break the approval habit by noticing when you seek it. Most people have no idea how often they seek approval in a single day, because the habit runs so quietly in the background that it feels like normal behavior rather than a repeated learned pattern. A slight pause before answering a question, waiting to read the room first. A small laugh at a joke that wasn't actually funny, just to keep things comfortable. A quick glance at someone's face after saying something honest, checking to see if it landed well. None of these moments feel dramatic on their own. Stacked together across an entire day, they reveal a mind constantly outsourcing a small piece of its own judgment to whoever happens to be nearby. The first step to breaking this pattern is not fixing it. It's simply noticing it, clearly and honestly, without judgment. Most people skip this step entirely, jumping straight to trying to stop seeking approval before they've ever actually caught themselves doing it in real time. This is like trying to break a habit you can't see. You need the noticing first, because noticing is what creates the possibility of choice. Without it, the pattern runs on autopilot, invisible and unquestioned. Start paying attention to the specific moments where approval seeking shows up. Notice it right after you speak, when your eyes automatically search a listener's face for a reaction. Notice it before you speak, when you quietly rehearse a safer version of what you actually think, trading honesty for likability before a single word leaves your mouth. Notice it in your body, a tightening in the chest right before sharing an opinion that might not be popular, a small relief when someone nods along, a small deflation when they don't. A weak, untrained mind treats every reaction from another person as a verdict. Someone frowns and the mind immediately assumes something was wrong. Someone stays quiet and the mind assumes disapproval. This kind of thinking traps you in a constant state of monitoring, where your own internal compass gets drowned out by an endless stream of external signals you were never actually equipped to read accurately in the first place. A strong, trained mind treats a reaction as just that, a reaction, one data point among many, filtered through someone else's mood, history, and limitations, not a final ruling on your worth or your correctness. Changing this doesn't require becoming a different person. It requires developing the courage to watch your own patterns honestly, the discipline to pause before reacting to someone else's reaction, and the humility to admit that a habit this deeply practiced won't disappear the first time you notice it. Noticing is not the same as fixing, but it is the doorway every single fix has to walk through first. Here's a simple practice to start building this awareness today. At the end of each day, briefly ask yourself, where did I seek approval today, and where did I trust myself instead? Don't judge the answer. Just notice it. You might notice you softened an opinion in a meeting to avoid pushback. You might notice you sent 3 additional messages after a text, checking that everything was okay. You might notice you didn't order what you actually wanted at dinner because someone else was watching. Each of these moments, once seen clearly, stops running invisibly in the background and starts becoming something you can actually work with. Think about how this pattern shows up across different areas of your life, because it rarely stays contained to just one. At work, it might look like agreeing to take on an extra task you didn't have time for, simply because saying no felt like it might damage how a manager perceives you. In friendships, it might look like laughing along with a joke that actually stung, because objecting felt like it would make you seem overly sensitive. In family settings, it might look like nodding along with an opinion you privately disagree with, because disagreement felt like it would create tension nobody wanted to deal with over dinner. None of these moments are dramatic on their own. Together, they paint a picture of a mind constantly scanning the room for cues about what will be accepted, rather than checking in with its own honest position first. There's also a physical dimension to this pattern worth paying close attention to. Notice what happens in your body in the seconds after you say something even slightly vulnerable or honest. A held breath, a slight stiffening in the shoulders, an almost involuntary glance toward the listener's face, searching for the smallest twitch of approval or disapproval before you allow yourself to relax. This physical scanning happens so quickly that most people never consciously register it happening at all. Slowing down enough to notice it, even just a handful of times a week, starts to bring an unconscious pattern into conscious awareness, and conscious awareness is the only place real change can actually begin. It also helps to recognize that this habit was not always working against you. Early in life, reading a room accurately and adjusting to avoid conflict was often a genuinely useful survival skill, especially in households or environments where disapproval carried real consequences. The problem isn't that this skill exists. The problem is that it never got updated for adulthood, where the actual stakes of a stranger's mild disapproval are considerably lower than they once were, yet the nervous system continues reacting as though the stakes are exactly as high as they used to be. There's a specific exercise worth trying this week to make this noticing concrete rather than abstract. Carry a small notepad or use your phone, and every time you catch yourself adjusting an opinion, a preference, or a decision based on anticipated reaction, jot down a single word or phrase describing what happened. Don't analyze it in the moment. Just capture it. By the end of a single day, most people are genuinely surprised by how many entries accumulate, often far more than they expected before actually tracking it deliberately. This surprise itself is valuable information, revealing just how automatic and invisible this pattern has become through years of repetition. There's an additional layer worth adding to this tracking exercise, noting not just that approval-seeking happened, but what you actually feared would occur if you hadn't sought it. Would the other person have gotten upset? Would they have thought less of you? Would the relationship have suffered in some specific way? Writing out this feared consequence explicitly often reveals just how vague and unexamined these fears typically are. Many people, once they actually try to articulate the specific feared outcome, realize they've never actually tested whether that outcome would occur. They've simply avoided the situation entirely, based on an assumption that's gone completely unchallenged for years. This is where the real opportunity for growth begins, not in the noticing alone, but in occasionally, deliberately choosing to test one of these long-held assumptions. Pick a low-stakes moment where you'd normally seek approval automatically, and instead, consciously choose not to, then pay close attention to what actually happens afterward. In the vast majority of cases, the feared consequence either doesn't materialize at all, or turns out to be considerably smaller and more manageable than anticipated. Each test like this chips away at the old assumption, replacing years of unexamined fear with a small but growing collection of direct, personal evidence. There's one more dimension of this noticing practice worth mentioning, extending it beyond your interactions with other people and into your relationship with content and media as well. Notice how often you seek a kind of borrowed approval through likes, views, or reactions on things you post or share. And notice the specific mood shift that happens when that external feedback doesn't arrive as quickly or as abundantly as hoped. This digital dimension of approval seeking operates through the exact same underlying mechanism as the interpersonal version, just delivered through a screen instead of a face. And it responds to the same fundamental practice of noticing first before attempting to change anything about it. Once you have even a day or two of this tracking, look for patterns. Do certain people trigger this behavior more than others? Do certain settings, work versus home, online versus in person, produce more of these moments? Does a particular emotion, tiredness, insecurity about a specific topic, tend to precede the behavior more reliably than others? These patterns, once visible, turn a vague general habit into something specific and addressable, because you can't effectively change a pattern you've only ever experienced as a diffuse, unnamed feeling running in the background of your days. Chapter 2. Stop outsourcing your worth to other people's opinions. Every time you let someone else's opinion decide how you feel about yourself, you hand them a piece of ownership over your inner life that they never asked for, and in most cases, never even noticed receiving. This is the real cost of approval seeking. It's not just exhausting, it's a slow, quiet transfer of authority, moving the power to decide your worth out of your own hands and into the hands of people who are, more often than not, simply reacting from their own mood, their own history, their own limited view of the situation. Think about how differently the exact same compliment or criticism lands depending entirely on who delivers it. Praise from someone who barely knows you can feel oddly hollow. Criticism from someone whose opinion you've quietly decided matters enormously can wreck an entire afternoon. Notice that the words themselves didn't change. What changed was how much authority you had already, often unconsciously assigned to that specific person's voice. This is the core mechanism behind outsourced worth. It's not really about what people say. It's about how much power you've already handed them before they ever said it. Reclaiming this power starts with a simple, honest audit. Ask yourself, whose opinion do I currently let define how I feel about myself? Write the names down if it helps. For each one, ask a second question. Has this person actually earned that level of influence through years of demonstrated care, honesty, and investment in me? Or did I simply hand it over by default, because they were loud or confident, or close to me physically, without ever consciously deciding they deserved that much weight. You'll likely find that some names on that list genuinely earned their place. A parent who has shown up consistently for decades, a close friend who tells you the truth even when it's uncomfortable. These are relationships built on real trust, and their input deserves real consideration. You'll also likely find other names that never should have made the list at all. A distant acquaintance, a stranger online, a co-worker you barely know outside of work hours. Somehow, their passing comment still manages to occupy real estate in your mind for days. The goal here isn't to become dismissive of everyone's opinion, cutting yourself off from feedback entirely. That would trade one problem for another. The goal is proportion, giving weight to opinions in proportion to how much someone has actually earned the right to shape how you see yourself. This single shift, weighting influence by earned trust instead of by volume or proximity, is one of the fastest ways to stop your self-worth from swinging wildly based on whoever happened to speak to you last. There's a deeper layer here worth naming directly. Even the opinions of people who have earned your trust are still just opinions. They are not verdicts. They are one perspective shaped by someone else's personality, mood, and history, offered from outside your own experience. Even the people who love you most are not infallible narrators of your worth. Their feedback can inform you. It should never be allowed to define you completely, because no single outside voice, however close, has full access to the whole picture of who you actually are. Building this internal ownership takes repetition. Every time you catch yourself waiting for someone's reaction before deciding how you feel about your own choice, pause and ask, what do I actually think about this, separate from what they might think? Answer that question first, honestly, before you even glance in their direction for confirmation. Over time, this reverses the entire order of operations. Instead of checking outward first and inward second, you start checking inward first, and outward only as additional information, never as the deciding vote. Consider how this plays out in a specific, everyday scenario. You share an idea in a group setting, and one person responds with a flat, unenthusiastic tone. If you've outsourced your worth to that reaction, the rest of your day can quietly shift, replaying the moment, wondering what was wrong with the idea, second-guessing whether you should have spoken at all. Now imagine the same scenario, but this time you check inward first. You ask yourself honestly, do I still think this idea had merit, separate from how it landed with one specific person in one specific moment? If the honest answer is yes, that flat reaction becomes simply information about that person's mood or preference, not a referendum on the quality of your thinking. This reordering, inward first, outward second, doesn't mean ignoring other people entirely or becoming immune to genuine feedback. It means the outward information gets added to an already formed internal opinion, rather than being allowed to overwrite an opinion that was never given the chance to fully form in the first place. Over time, this reordering becomes less effortful and more automatic, the same way any new sequence becomes smoother with repetition. There's an important nuance worth naming here about the difference between people whose feedback is genuinely useful and people whose feedback simply carries volume or confidence. A person can deliver an opinion with tremendous certainty and still be entirely wrong, or simply speaking from limited information. Confidence in delivery and accuracy in content are two completely separate things, and conflating them is one of the fastest ways to hand your self-worth to the loudest voice in any given room, rather than to the most accurate or well-intentioned one. It also helps to recognize a specific trap many people fall into once they start this work, swinging too far in the opposite direction and dismissing all outside feedback entirely, treating every piece of input as an attack to be defended against. This isn't the goal either. The goal is calibration, not elimination. Genuine feedback from people who have earned your trust remains valuable and worth genuinely considering. What changes is the automatic, unquestioned authority given to every reaction from every person, regardless of how much that specific person has actually earned the right to shape your sense of self. Consider building a simple, honest hierarchy of whose input actually deserves weight in your life, not to create rigid rules, but to bring conscious clarity to something that's currently operating unconsciously. At the top might sit a small handful of people who have demonstrated repeatedly that they know you well and want genuinely good things for you. In the middle might sit people whose input is situationally useful, a colleague's perspective on a work decision, a doctor's medical opinion, valuable within their specific domain, but not necessarily extending into every other area of your life. At the bottom, or perhaps not on the list at all, sit the voices that currently occupy far more mental space than they've ever earned. Strangers, distant acquaintances, people whose only real qualification for influencing your self-worth is that they happen to say something and you happen to hear it. This hierarchy isn't about ranking people's worth as human beings. Everyone deserves basic respect and kindness regardless of where they land on this particular scale. It's specifically about ranking how much authority their opinion should carry over how you feel about yourself, which is a considerably narrower and more useful question. Once this hierarchy becomes conscious rather than automatic, it becomes much easier to notice when a low-tier voice is somehow occupying high-tier real estate in your mind, and to consciously correct that imbalance rather than letting it continue unexamined. There's a modern dimension to this problem worth naming specifically: the sheer volume of anonymous or semi-anonymous opinions available through comments, messages, and social platforms, each one a potential voice competing for space in your internal hierarchy. A single dismissive comment from someone you'll never meet, with no context about your life, your effort, or your circumstances, can occupy hours of mental space if left unexamined, purely because it arrived with enough emotional charge to grab attention. Applying the same hierarchy exercise specifically to online interactions, asking honestly what qualification this particular voice actually has to weigh in on your worth, tends to dramatically reduce how much weight these fundamentally uninformed opinions are allowed to carry. It's worth remembering that even well-intentioned people sometimes offer opinions outside their actual area of competence or context. A friend who has never navigated your specific career field might offer confident advice about a professional decision, genuinely wanting to help, while lacking the actual information needed to offer genuinely useful guidance. Recognizing the difference between good intentions and actual qualification helps you receive their care warmly while still maintaining appropriate skepticism about the specific content of their advice. There's a final, practical tool worth adding to this chapter, a simple phrase to use internally whenever you notice a low-tier opinion starting to occupy more space than it deserves. This person's reaction is information about them, not a verdict about me. Repeating this specific framing, even silently, tends to interrupt the automatic authority-granting process before it fully takes hold, creating just enough distance to evaluate the opinion on its actual merits, rather than absorbing it wholesale simply because it arrived with enough emotional force to demand attention. There's a broader life pattern this entire chapter is ultimately pointing toward, that the quality of your life tends to improve considerably once the authority over your own worth gets redistributed away from a wide, undiscriminating crowd and concentrated instead among a small number of people who have genuinely earned that level of trust and influence. This redistribution doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't require dramatic confrontation with anyone. It happens quietly, through the internal practice of consistently asking who actually deserves this weight, and adjusting accordingly, one interaction at a time, until the new pattern eventually becomes simply how you operate by default. Chapter 3. Build self-respect by keeping promises to yourself. Self-respect is not something you can talk yourself into. It's not built through affirmations repeated in a mirror, or through convincing yourself with clever mental arguments that you deserve confidence. Real self-respect is built the same way trust is built in any relationship, through a consistent track record of promises made and promises kept. The difference is simply that in this case, the relationship is with yourself, and you are both the one making the promise and the one deciding whether to honor it. Think about how trust actually forms between two people. It's not built through grand declarations. It's built through small repeated moments. Someone says they'll call and they call. Someone says they'll show up and they show up. Over time, these small kept promises accumulate into something solid, a track record strong enough to withstand doubt. Self-respect works exactly the same way internally. Every time you tell yourself you'll do something, and then you actually do it, You deposit a small amount of evidence into your own internal account. Every time you say you will and then don't, without a genuinely good reason, you make a withdrawal, and that account, like any other, can run dry if it's withdrawn from too often. Most people build their self-image around big, dramatic commitments, promising to completely transform their life, their career, their relationships, in one bold move. These promises are exciting to make and, more often than not, difficult to keep, which means they tend to produce more evidence against yourself than evidence for yourself. A more reliable approach involves small, almost boring promises, ones easy enough to actually keep consistently. Promise yourself you'll get up when the alarm goes off, without negotiating with yourself for 20 extra minutes. Promise yourself you'll finish the task you started before moving to something more comfortable. Promise yourself you'll speak honestly in a specific conversation instead of softening the truth to keep the peace. None of these promises are impressive on their own. Their power comes from repetition, not size. Athletes don't build strength through one enormous, dramatic workout. They build it through the same fundamental movements, repeated with consistency day after day, until strength becomes the default state rather than a temporary achievement. Self-respect is built the exact same way. It's not one heroic act of willpower. It's hundreds of small, unremarkable moments where you chose to keep your word to yourself, even when no one else was watching and no one else would have known if you hadn't. There's a specific reason this particular kind of consistency matters so much for approval seeking specifically. When your self-respect is built on a real internal track record, someone else's disapproval doesn't hit the same way. If you already know through repeated evidence that you follow through on what you say, a single critical comment from someone else can't undo years of proof you've built for yourself. But if your self-image is fragile, built mostly on hope rather than evidence, a single piece of criticism can feel like it's revealing some deep hidden truth about your worthlessness, because there's no solid internal record standing in the way to contradict it. Start small this week. Choose one promise to yourself, specific and genuinely achievable, and keep it without exception. Not a New Year's resolution-sized commitment, something almost embarrassingly modest. Drink water before coffee each morning. Reply to messages within the same day, instead of letting them pile up out of avoidance. Speak one honest sentence in a conversation where you'd normally stay quiet to keep things comfortable. Keep that promise consistently, and notice how differently you feel about your own word after a week of doing exactly what you said you would. There's a specific reason small, boring promises work better than large, dramatic ones, and it has to do with how trust actually accumulates in any relationship, including the one you have with yourself. Trust is rarely built through a single grand gesture. It's built through repetition, through a pattern reliable enough that it no longer needs to be consciously tracked because it has simply become expected. A friend who shows up on time for years earns a kind of trust that a friend who occasionally shows up spectacularly early but often shows up late never quite manages to build, regardless of how impressive the good moments were. The same logic applies internally. 100 small kept promises build a sturdier foundation than one dramatic promise kept once and never repeated. This also explains why so many people feel a persistent, low-grade sense of not trusting themselves, despite having accomplished genuinely impressive things over the years. Impressive accomplishments often come from motivation, adrenaline, or external pressure, not from a consistent internal practice of promise-keeping. You can win a major achievement and still privately doubt whether you'll follow through on tomorrow's small commitment, because the achievement and the daily promise-keeping are, in practice, two very different systems, and only one of them actually builds the specific kind of self-trust this chapter is describing. Think about what happens when you break a small promise to yourself and simply let it slide without acknowledgement. You told yourself you'd go for a walk and you didn't, and instead of noticing this honestly, you quickly moved on, perhaps even constructing a small justification for why it didn't matter this time. Each unacknowledged broken promise doesn't just fail to build trust. It actively erodes it, teaching your own mind on a quiet subconscious level that your word doesn't actually require follow-through. Over enough repetitions, this erosion becomes the default expectation you carry into every new commitment. which is precisely why so many people struggle to believe in their own follow-through even when they genuinely want to change. The remedy isn't self-punishment when a promise gets broken. It's honest acknowledgement, followed by a recommitment to the next opportunity. Notice the broken promise plainly. I said I would do this, and I didn't. Then, rather than spiraling into self-criticism, simply identify the very next chance to keep a similarly sized promise and follow through on that one. This is how the account starts refilling, not through perfection, but through a consistent return to the practice every time it slips. There's a specific reason this practice needs to start small rather than ambitious, and it has to do with how self-trust actually compounds. If you begin with an oversized promise, something requiring significant willpower or dramatic life change, the odds of successfully keeping it consistently are considerably lower, which means you're more likely to add to the pattern of broken promises than to interrupt it. Starting almost embarrassingly small removes this risk almost entirely. A promise so modest that failing to keep it would require genuine active avoidance is precisely the kind of promise that reliably gets kept, and reliably kept promises, however small, are exactly what this chapter is built around. Once a small promise has been kept consistently for a couple of weeks, the natural instinct is often to immediately scale up, adding a second, larger promise on top of the first. This can work, though it's worth pacing carefully, watching for the same signs that indicated the first promise was appropriately sized, achievable without heroic effort, specific enough to clearly measure, small enough to survive a busy or difficult day without being abandoned. Scaling too quickly risks recreating the exact pattern of ambitious, unkept promises this practice was designed to move away from in the first place. There's also real value in choosing promises that are visible only to you, at least at first. A promise witnessed by others carries a different kind of pressure, one driven partly by social consequence rather than purely by internal commitment. Building the specific muscle. This chapter describes benefits from promises kept purely because you said you would, with no one else aware enough to notice or care whether you followed through, because that is precisely the condition under which genuine self-trust gets tested and built most reliably. There's a specific way to handle the inevitable moment when life genuinely interferes with a kept promise, illness, an emergency, a circumstance truly outside your control. This is different from simply not feeling like following through, and treating the two situations identically does more harm than good. When a promise is broken for a genuinely legitimate reason, the healthy response is honest acknowledgement without excessive self-punishment. This didn't happen because I lacked follow-through. It happened because something genuinely unexpected occurred, followed by a clear plan for when the promise will be picked back up. This distinction protects the practice from becoming rigid or punishing in a way that would eventually make you resent and abandon it altogether. Over months of consistent practice, something subtle but significant tends to shift in how you generally approach new commitments both to yourself and to others. Having built a genuine track record of follow-through, you become more willing to make commitments in the first place, since the fear of your own unreliability, which once made even small promises feel risky, gradually recedes. This creates a positive cycle. More confidence in your own follow-through leads to more willingness to commit, which leads to more evidence of follow-through, which further strengthens the confidence, compounding steadily over time in a way that a single, dramatic burst of willpower never could. There's a specific way to notice this compounding effect taking hold, paying attention to how quickly you now recover from an occasional broken promise compared to how you might have reacted early in this practice. Where a broken promise once might have triggered a spiral of self-criticism lasting an entire day, a well-established practice tends to produce a much faster reset. Acknowledge, recommit, move forward, often within minutes rather than hours. This faster recovery time is itself a form of evidence, proof that the underlying relationship with your own word has genuinely strengthened, even when a specific individual promise happens to fall through. Chapter 4. Set boundaries without needing permission. One of the clearest signs of approval seeking is the instinct to ask permission before setting a boundary that was never actually up for negotiation in the first place. Notice how often a simple no gets wrapped in an apology, a justification, or an anxious explanation, as though the other person's agreement is required before the boundary is allowed to exist. A boundary that requires someone else's approval to be valid isn't really a boundary. It's a request, one that can be denied, argued with, or slowly worn down over time. Real boundaries don't ask for permission. They state a fact about your own limits and let that fact stand on its own. I'm not available this weekend. That doesn't work for me. I need to step away from this conversation for now. None of these statements are cruel. None of them require an elaborate justification to be legitimate. They simply describe where your limit sits, and they trust that limit enough to state it, without immediately apologizing for having one. This shift feels uncomfortable at first, precisely because approval-seeking has trained you to believe that stating a limit clearly, without softening it into oblivion, will be read as selfish or cold. In practice, the opposite tends to be true. Vague apologetic boundaries, wrapped in excessive justification, often get pushed against, because they signal uncertainty, an opening for negotiation. Clear, calm boundaries, stated plainly and without extended defense, tend to get respected far more consistently because they signal a settled decision rather than a tentative suggestion waiting for approval to become real. Building this skill starts small. Practice stating a minor preference plainly, without immediately softening it with an apology or an explanation nobody asked for. I'd rather go somewhere else for dinner. I'm going to head out a little early tonight. Notice the urge to add 3 additional sentences justifying the statement, and practice letting the single sentence stand on its own instead. This feels strange the first few times. It gets easier every time you do it, and each successful attempt becomes more evidence for the internal account you're building in the previous chapter. There's a specific fear worth naming directly here, the fear that people will simply stop liking you if you stop constantly seeking their approval before acting. This fear feels enormous in the moment and rarely matches reality once tested. Most relationships worth keeping can absolutely tolerate a calmly stated boundary. The relationships that genuinely cannot tolerate it were likely relying on your constant self-minimizing to stay comfortable in the first place, which is not a foundation worth protecting at the cost of your own self-respect. Think about the specific language patterns that tend to weaken a boundary before it's even fully spoken. Phrases like, "I'm so sorry, but," or "I hate to even bring this up," or "this is probably silly, but," all function as a kind of preemptive apology, softening a statement that never actually required softening in the first place. Notice how these phrases shift the entire emotional framing of the sentence that follows. A boundary introduced with an apology sounds like a favor being requested. The same boundary, stated plainly without the apology, sounds like a fact being communicated. The content barely changes. The perceived strength changes considerably. There's also a common misconception worth addressing directly that boundaries need to be defended with evidence in order to be legitimate. In reality, a boundary is valid simply because it reflects an actual limit, not because it has been proven correct to someone else's satisfaction. You don't need 3 supporting reasons for why you can't attend an event. You don't need to justify why a certain topic is off limits in conversation. The limit exists because it exists, and requiring outside validation before you're allowed to honor it simply hands your own boundaries over to be evaluated and potentially overruled by someone else's opinion. It's worth naming honestly that setting a boundary without apology will occasionally be met with pushback, confusion, or even mild hurt feelings from the other person, especially if they've grown accustomed to a version of you that rarely said no. This reaction, uncomfortable as it feels in the moment, is not proof that the boundary was wrong to state. It's simply evidence that a pattern is shifting, and shifting patterns are rarely comfortable for anyone involved, including the person setting the new boundary for the first time. A useful practice for building this skill involves starting with boundaries that carry relatively low stakes, then gradually working up to more significant ones as the discomfort becomes more familiar and more manageable. Practice saying no to a minor request from a stranger or acquaintance before attempting to set a more emotionally loaded boundary with a close family member. Each successful, calm boundary, held without an accompanying flood of justification, becomes evidence that you can survive the brief discomfort of disapproval, which makes the next boundary, and the one after that, considerably easier to hold. There's a particular category of boundary worth addressing separately. Boundaries with people who are used to a specific version of you, one that historically never pushed back. In these relationships, the first calmly stated boundary often produces the strongest reaction, precisely because it disrupts an established, comfortable pattern the other person has come to rely on, often without ever consciously realizing they were relying on it. This initial friction is not a sign that the boundary was a mistake. It's simply the natural cost of updating a long-standing dynamic, and it tends to settle considerably once the other person adjusts to the new, clearer version of the relationship. It also helps to prepare mentally for the specific tactics that sometimes follow a newly stated boundary. Guilt trips, minimizing language, questions like, "Are you serious right now?" or accusations of having changed for the worse. None of these responses actually disprove the validity of the boundary. They're simply attempts, often unconscious rather than deliberately manipulative, to restore the previous, more comfortable arrangement. Recognizing these responses for what they are, rather than mistaking them for genuine evidence that the boundary was wrong, makes it considerably easier to hold steady through the initial discomfort of enforcing something new. A useful phrase to keep in mind through this process is that a boundary is not a debate. Once stated clearly, it doesn't require continued defense every time someone expresses displeasure with it. "I've already shared my decision on this" can be a complete, sufficient response to continued pushback, delivered calmly, without needing to reopen an explanation that was never actually required in the first place. There's a specific skill worth practicing for the moment, right after a boundary meets resistance: staying quiet rather than immediately filling the silence with additional justification. Silence in this specific context is not rudeness. It's simply refusing to treat a stated boundary as an opening bid in a negotiation. Most people, uncomfortable with silence, instinctively rush to fill it with more words the moment pushback appears, which is exactly the moment those additional words tend to do the most damage. Reopening a decision that had already been clearly and completely stated. It also helps to distinguish between boundaries that require ongoing enforcement and boundaries that are simply stated once and then demonstrated through consistent action afterward. Some boundaries need to be repeated calmly each time they're tested, particularly with people who are slow to adjust to a new dynamic. Others are best enforced silently, through action rather than repeated verbal reminders, simply not engaging with a specific topic when it arises again, rather than re-explaining each time why that topic is off limits. Choosing the right approach for each specific boundary, rather than applying a single rigid method to every situation, tends to produce considerably better results, with considerably less ongoing friction. There's a final consideration worth naming about boundaries, specifically related to time and energy. Resisting the urge to explain a boundary in terms of how busy you are, since this framing implicitly suggests that if you simply weren't busy, the boundary would no longer apply. A boundary framed around genuine priority, "This isn't something I choose to make space for right now," tends to hold up more consistently than one framed purely around scheduling constraints, which invites the counter-argument that a schedule could always, in theory, be rearranged. Ultimately, the boundaries covered throughout this chapter share a single underlying purpose: protecting the same self-respect this entire video is built around. Every boundary held without apology, every limit stated without an accompanying flood of justification, becomes one more piece of evidence that your own judgment about your own limits deserves to be trusted by you, before it's ever handed over for anyone else's approval or permission. Chapter 5. Separate feedback from your identity. Feedback and identity get tangled together constantly, and untangling them is one of the most powerful shifts available to anyone trying to build unshakable self-respect. A piece of criticism about a specific action gets received as a verdict on your entire character. You made a mistake in a report becomes, "I am incompetent." You were late to an event becomes, "I am inconsiderate." This conversion from a specific, correctable action into a permanent statement about who you fundamentally are is exactly what makes ordinary feedback feel unbearable, and exactly what keeps you scrambling for approval to counteract that unbearable feeling. Learning to separate these two things starts with a simple habit: translating identity-level statements back down into their more accurate, action-specific form. When a thought arrives sounding like "I'm terrible at this," pause and ask what specifically happened. Usually, the honest answer is much smaller and much more fixable than the identity-level statement suggests. "I made an error in one section of this project" is considerably different from "I am terrible at this," even though the anxious mind will happily blur the two together if you let it. This distinction matters enormously for approval seeking, because a mind that treats every piece of feedback as an identity verdict has no choice but to chase constant reassurance, since any single critical comment threatens to collapse the entire structure of self-worth. A mind that treats feedback as specific, actionable information about one particular moment doesn't need that same level of constant reassurance, because no single comment carries the power to redefine an entire identity built on much more evidence than one remark could ever account for. There's a specific pattern worth watching for in your own internal language: the difference between statements that use the verb to be versus statements that describe a specific action. "I am a failure" is an identity statement, sweeping and permanent. "I failed at this specific task" is an action statement, contained and correctable. The mind slides toward identity statements because they feel more emotionally significant, more dramatic, somehow more honest. In reality, they're almost always less accurate, because a single action, however disappointing, is never actually equivalent to the totality of who you are across every context and every moment of your life. This translation skill matters most in the immediate aftermath of criticism, when the emotional charge is highest and the mind is most likely to reach for the broadest, most damaging interpretation available. In that moment, pausing to ask, "What specifically happened?" separate from "what this seems to mean about me," creates a small but critical gap. Inside that gap, the actual containable problem becomes visible again, rather than remaining buried underneath an avalanche of identity-level conclusions that were never actually supported by the evidence in front of you. It also helps to notice how this same identity-collapsing pattern shows up in how you interpret compliments, not just criticism, though it tends to work in the opposite emotional direction. A specific compliment about one piece of work can get inflated into a broad identity-level story. "I'm clearly the best at this," which sets up an equally fragile foundation, one that collapses just as quickly the next time a piece of feedback isn't glowing. Genuine, stable self-respect doesn't inflate with praise or collapse with criticism. It stays relatively steady, informed by both, defined entirely by neither. Building this steadiness requires practicing the same translation skill in both directions, treating both praise and criticism as specific, useful information about a specific moment, rather than as permanent verdicts to be either celebrated or mourned. Over time, this creates a kind of emotional floor that doesn't rise and fall wildly with every single piece of feedback that happens to arrive on a given day. There's a specific mental habit worth building to reinforce this separation, imagining how you would respond if a close friend came to you with the exact same piece of criticism about themselves. If a friend said, "I made an error in a report," would you conclude that they were fundamentally incompetent as a person? Almost certainly not. You'd likely see it clearly for what it actually was: a single, correctable mistake, deserving of a reasonable response rather than a sweeping character judgment. This same clarity is available for your own situations. It simply gets clouded by proximity and emotional charge when the mistake is your own rather than someone else's. Practicing this imagined friend perspective regularly helps recalibrate a distorted internal response back towards something more proportionate and accurate. It doesn't require pretending the mistake didn't happen or wasn't worth addressing. It requires applying the same reasonable, measured standard to yourself that you would naturally extend to someone else you cared about, rather than reserving an unusually harsh, identity-collapsing standard exclusively for your own errors while extending genuine grace to everyone else's. There's also a longer-term benefit worth naming, that consistently practicing this separation changes how quickly you recover from setbacks generally. A mind that treats every mistake as an identity verdict needs considerable time to recover from even minor errors, since the perceived damage extends far beyond the actual event. A mind that treats mistakes as specific containable information recovers considerably faster because there's simply less collateral damage to repair once the actual, narrow problem has been addressed. There's a final, useful distinction worth drawing between processing a mistake and dwelling on it. Processing involves acknowledging what happened, extracting whatever lesson is genuinely available, and then consciously moving forward. Dwelling involves replaying the same mistake repeatedly, well past the point where any new insight is being generated, simply reinforcing the emotional charge without producing any further value. Learning to recognize the exact moment when processing has finished and dwelling has begun is a skill that develops naturally as this entire practice of separating feedback from identity becomes more familiar and automatic over time. Practice this translation actively. The next time you receive criticism, however mild, pause before reacting and ask, what is the specific, factual content of this feedback, separate from how it feels? Write it down, if that helps create distance. You'll often find that the actual content is manageable, even useful, once it's been separated from the emotional weight your mind instinctively attached to it. That emotional weight was never part of the original feedback. It was added afterward, by an old habit of treating every critical word as a threat to your entire sense of self. Chapter 6. Stop over-explaining your decisions. Over-explaining is one of the most common and most exhausting symptoms of approval seeking. A simple decision gets buried under 3 unnecessary justifications, each one an attempt to preempt disapproval before it can even arrive. I can't make it this weekend, I have a lot going on, and I promised my sister I'd help her with something. And I'm honestly just really tired lately, too. Notice how a single, complete sentence, I can't make it this weekend, quietly expanded into an entire defense, as though the original statement wasn't allowed to simply exist without backup. Here's the uncomfortable truth about over-explaining. The more you justify a decision that was never actually up for debate, the more you signal, often without meaning to, that the decision itself feels shaky. A person who is genuinely secure in a choice rarely needs more than a sentence to state it. A person quietly doubting whether the choice will be accepted often reaches almost automatically for additional justification, as if enough supporting reasons might finally silence an internal uncertainty that words alone were never actually going to resolve. This habit also invites exactly the negotiation it was trying to avoid. Every additional reason offered becomes something the other person can individually challenge or counter. I have a lot going on gets met with, well, can't that wait? I'm tired gets met with, but this is important. A single complete decline stated once and left alone leaves nothing behind to argue with, precisely because nothing was offered as negotiable in the first place. Breaking this habit starts with catching yourself mid-explanation and asking, does this next sentence add necessary information, or is it here purely to manage how this decision will be received? If it's the second, stop there. Let the original sentence stand. This will feel incomplete at first, like you're leaving something important unsaid. In practice, you're simply removing the part of the sentence that was never actually about communication and was really about seeking approval for a decision that didn't need it. Notice how differently a decline lands depending on how much explanation surrounds it. I can't help with this right now lands as a clean, complete statement. I can't help with this right now because I have 3 other deadlines this week, and I'm honestly a bit behind on everything. And I also promised myself I'd rest more this month lands as something considerably more negotiable, almost inviting the listener to respond to each individual point, perhaps suggesting the other deadlines could be shifted, or questioning whether resting more is really a good enough reason. The single sentence closes the conversation. The extended explanation reopens it, precisely at the moment you are hoping to close it for good. This pattern often traces back to a deeper belief worth naming directly, that other people are owed a full account of your internal reasoning before they're allowed to accept a decision that affects only you. In most everyday situations, this belief simply isn't true. A decision about your own time, your own energy, or your own boundaries doesn't require a courtroom-style presentation of evidence. It requires a clear statement, delivered with enough calm confidence that no additional defense feels necessary. There's a specific exception worth acknowledging honestly, situations where genuine transparency actually serves the relationship, where sharing context helps someone understand you better rather than simply managing their reaction to you. The distinction lies in the underlying motivation. Context offered because it genuinely deepens mutual understanding is different from context offered purely to prevent disapproval. The words might look almost identical on the surface. The intention behind them and the emotional charge carried within them is usually quite different, and noticing that difference honestly is part of what makes this chapter's practice sustainable, rather than becoming its own rigid rule applied indiscriminately in every situation. Practicing brevity here doesn't mean becoming curt or dismissive toward people who genuinely deserve warmth and context. It means recognizing the specific moments where extra words are functioning as an anxious defense rather than as genuine communication, and choosing, in those specific moments, to let the shorter, more confident version of the sentence do the work instead. There's a specific reason this practice feels so uncomfortable for people who have spent years over-explaining. It can feel almost rude, as though a short answer is somehow withholding something the other person deserves. This feeling is worth examining honestly, because it rarely reflects an actual social rule being violated. Most people, most of the time, accept a clear, brief decline without requiring an accompanying essay of justification. The discomfort belongs almost entirely to the person offering the brief answer, not to the person receiving it, which suggests the discomfort is really about an internal habit being interrupted, rather than about any real social expectation being unmet. A useful transitional practice involves allowing yourself one sentence of context, if it genuinely feels necessary, and then deliberately stopping there, resisting the urge to add a second, third, or fourth supporting point. This creates a middle ground between the old habit of extensive justification and the newer, more confident habit of a single, clean statement, allowing the shift to happen gradually rather than requiring an immediate, uncomfortable leap from one extreme to the other. It's also worth noticing how this pattern shows up specifically in written communication, texts, and emails, where the temptation to over-explain often intensifies because there's time to keep adding sentences before hitting send. Reading back a message before sending it, specifically looking for sentences that exist purely to manage the recipient's reaction rather than to convey new information, and deleting those specific sentences is a concrete, practical habit that reinforces everything covered in this chapter. There's a specific social skill worth developing alongside this practice, learning to tolerate the brief pause that sometimes follows a short, clear answer without rushing to fill it. When you offer a single, complete sentence instead of an extended explanation, there's often a beat of silence afterward, especially if the other person is used to receiving a longer justification. That silence can feel uncomfortable, almost like an invitation to keep talking. Learning to simply let that silence exist without treating it as a signal that more words are needed is part of what makes brevity actually work as a practice, rather than immediately collapsing back into the old habit the moment discomfort appears. It's also useful to recognize that some relationships genuinely do function better with more context and explanation, particularly relationships built on deep mutual transparency, where both people generally share reasoning as a normal part of how they communicate. The goal of this chapter was never to eliminate context entirely from every interaction. It's specifically to eliminate the excess context that exists purely to manage anticipated disapproval while preserving genuine, mutually valued transparency in the relationships where that transparency actually serves connection rather than serving anxiety. There's a useful final check worth applying to any explanation before offering it, asking whether the same information would still feel necessary to share if you were completely certain the other person would respond with total acceptance regardless. If the answer is yes, the explanation is likely genuine and worth including. If the answer is no, if the explanation only feels necessary because of uncertainty about how it will land, that's a strong signal the explanation exists to manage approval rather than to communicate something genuinely useful, and it's a strong candidate for the kind of trimming this entire chapter has been describing. Chapter 7. Choose discomfort over people-pleasing. People-pleasing feels like kindness from the inside, and it frequently produces the opposite of connection over time. Constantly adjusting your preferences, opinions, and needs to match whatever will keep everyone comfortable trains the people around you to expect a version of you that isn't actually real, and it trains you to become increasingly disconnected from your own preferences, since they get overridden so consistently that they eventually stop showing up clearly at all. The alternative isn't becoming difficult or combative. It's choosing the discomfort of occasionally disappointing someone over the much larger, slower cost of disappointing yourself repeatedly. This trade feels backwards at first because the discomfort of disagreement is immediate and visible, while the cost of constant self-erasure builds slowly and quietly in the background until it eventually surfaces as exhaustion, resentment, or a strange, persistent feeling of not knowing who you actually are anymore. Practice choosing this discomfort in low-stakes situations first. State an honest preference about where to eat, even if it's not the easiest option for everyone else. Voice a genuine opinion in a casual conversation, even if it doesn't match the room. Notice the brief spike of discomfort that follows, and notice that, in the vast majority of cases, nothing catastrophic happens afterward. This evidence, gathered repeatedly across small moments, gradually rewires the assumption that disagreement equals danger, replacing it with a more accurate, more useful understanding. That most people can tolerate a different opinion far better than approval-seeking has led you to believe. There's a specific cost to chronic people-pleasing that rarely gets named directly, the way it slowly erodes your own ability to know what you actually want. When preferences get overridden consistently enough, for long enough, the internal signal that generates them starts to weaken from disuse, the same way any unused muscle eventually loses strength. This explains why some people, after years of consistently deferring to others, find themselves genuinely unable to answer a simple question like, "What do you actually want to do this weekend?" without a strange, uncomfortable blankness where a clear preference used to be. Rebuilding this internal signal starts with deliberately practicing low-stakes preference statements, even in situations where the outcome barely matters. Choosing a restaurant, picking a movie, deciding which route to take on a walk. These decisions carry almost no real risk, which makes them ideal practice grounds for strengthening a muscle that has gone soft from years of automatic deference. The goal isn't to become rigidly attached to getting your way in these small moments. It's simply to practice noticing and voicing an actual preference, rather than defaulting immediately to whatever seems easiest for everyone else. There's also a specific kind of grief worth acknowledging honestly here, the grief of realizing how much of yourself has been quietly set aside over years of prioritizing everyone else's comfort. This realization can feel disorienting, even sad, and it's worth sitting with rather than rushing past. That sadness isn't a sign that something has gone wrong with this process. It's a sign that something real is being recovered, a version of yourself that existed before the pattern took hold, waiting patiently underneath years of accumulated deference for the chance to be heard again. There's a specific, common fear worth addressing directly here, that choosing yourself occasionally will turn you into the kind of person who never considers anyone else, sliding from one extreme, constant self-sacrifice, straight into the opposite extreme, constant self-centeredness. In practice, this slide rarely happens the way the fear predicts. Someone who has spent years attuned to other people's needs, sometimes to their own detriment, typically retains a genuine capacity for care and consideration, even after learning to voice their own preferences more honestly. The skill being built here is balance, not a personality transplant, adding your own voice back into a dynamic that had previously excluded it almost entirely, not eliminating everyone else's voice in the process. Consider keeping a simple, ongoing tally for a week, noticing each time you chose your own genuine preference over immediate comfort for someone else, and each time you chose comfort over your own preference instead. This isn't about achieving a perfect 50-50 balance, it's about generating honest awareness of your current default setting, since most people significantly overestimate how often they actually assert their own preferences, until they start tracking it deliberately and see the real numbers for themselves. It's also worth naming that some relationships will genuinely test this shift more than others, and family relationships often test it the hardest, precisely because the pattern of deference in those relationships tends to be the oldest and most deeply practiced. Expect more resistance, both internal and external, when practicing this specific skill with family members than with newer relationships, and treat that increased difficulty as expected rather than as evidence that something has gone wrong with the approach itself. There's a helpful reframe worth adopting when facing this increased family resistance, specifically recognizing that the discomfort you're feeling is often mirrored in a different form by the people who are used to a more accommodating version of you. Their confusion or pushback isn't necessarily malicious. It's often a genuine adjustment problem, a family system recalibrating around a member who has started behaving in an unfamiliar, unpredicted way. Approaching this transition with patience for both yourself and them, while still holding steady on the actual change you're making, tends to produce a smoother adjustment than either backing down entirely or approaching the shift as an adversarial battle to be won. It's worth adding a final practical note about pacing this particular chapter's practice. Attempting to overhaul every people-pleasing pattern across every relationship simultaneously tends to produce overwhelm and inconsistency. A more sustainable approach involves choosing one specific relationship or one specific type of situation to focus on first, building genuine confidence and comfort there before expanding the practice into other areas of life. This measured pacing, while less dramatic than an all-at-once transformation, tends to produce considerably more durable, lasting change. There's one more encouraging observation worth sharing before moving forward, that the people who benefit most from a friend or family member finally voicing genuine preferences are often, somewhat surprisingly, the people closest to that person. Being on the receiving end of constant accommodation can quietly create its own pressure, a nagging uncertainty about whether the accommodating person's needs are actually being met or simply hidden. When someone finally starts voicing real preferences, close relationships often experience relief alongside the initial adjustment, since it removes the guesswork previously required to figure out what someone actually wanted underneath their constant agreeableness. Chapter 8. Build confidence through evidence, not affirmations. Confidence built purely on repeated affirmations tends to be fragile because it isn't actually anchored to anything real. Telling yourself you're capable, without any evidence backing the statement, produces a thin, unstable version of confidence that collapses the moment it's genuinely tested. Confidence built on accumulated evidence, specific moments where you actually did the hard thing, actually kept the promise, actually survived the disapproval you were afraid of, is considerably harder to shake because it isn't a belief you're trying to convince yourself of. It's a conclusion drawn from your own observed track record. Start keeping a mental or even written record of moments where you acted despite fear of disapproval and the outcome was manageable. The time you said no and the relationship survived. The time you shared an unpopular opinion and the conversation continued normally. The time you set a boundary and, contrary to every anxious prediction, nothing fell apart. Each of these moments becomes real evidence, considerably more convincing than any affirmation repeated in a mirror, because it's drawn directly from your own lived experience rather than from a hopeful statement you're attempting to manufacture belief in advance. This distinction matters because affirmation-based confidence tends to require constant maintenance, repeated daily, often with diminishing returns, because the underlying mind knows on some level that the statement isn't yet backed by proof. Evidence-based confidence requires no such maintenance, because it isn't a belief being defended against doubt. It's simply an accurate summary of what has actually happened, and accurate summaries don't need to be repeated with the same anxious frequency that unproven hopes do. Start building this evidence log deliberately if the idea of simply remembering it feels unreliable. A brief note at the end of a day, one sentence describing a moment where you acted from your own judgment, despite a fear of disapproval, accumulates over weeks into a genuinely persuasive body of proof. Reading back through even a month of these entries during a moment of self-doubt tends to be considerably more effective than reciting a general affirmation, precisely because the entries are specific, dated, and undeniably real, rather than abstract and aspirational. There's a particular kind of confidence this practice builds that's worth naming directly, the confidence that you can survive disapproval, rather than the confidence that you'll never encounter it. This is a meaningfully different and considerably more useful target. Trying to build confidence that assumes universal approval sets an impossible standard that reality will inevitably violate. Building confidence around your own capacity to remain steady, even when approval doesn't arrive, creates a foundation that doesn't depend on controlling how everyone else reacts, which is, ultimately, something you were never actually able to control in the first place. There's a specific way to strengthen this evidence-gathering practice further, categorizing entries by which specific fear they directly disproved. If a persistent fear has been that people will stop respecting you if you disagree with them, actively look for and record moments that contradict this specific fear. Times you disagreed and respect, as far as you could tell, remained fully intact afterward. This targeted approach builds evidence exactly where the doubt is strongest, rather than gathering generic confidence, unrelated to the specific fears actually driving the approval-seeking pattern in the first place. It's worth being honest that this evidence-based approach requires patience, since a single week of entries rarely feels sufficient to override years of an established belief. Genuine, durable confidence built this way tends to accumulate gradually, over months rather than days, which can feel discouraging to anyone hoping for a faster transformation. The trade-off is durability. Confidence built slowly, through repeated, undeniable evidence, tends to hold up considerably better under real pressure than confidence built quickly through a single motivational insight or an inspiring video watched once and then forgotten by the following week. There's also value in occasionally sharing specific entries from this evidence log with someone you trust, not for their approval of the log itself, but because saying these moments out loud or writing them down for someone else to read tends to solidify them further in memory. What gets spoken or shared often becomes more concrete and more accessible during future moments of doubt than what stays purely private and unspoken. There's a final, practical suggestion worth including here: revisiting this evidence log, specifically before situations where old approval-seeking patterns are likely to resurface. An upcoming difficult conversation, a presentation, a gathering with people whose opinions have historically carried too much weight. Reading through several relevant entries right before walking into that specific situation tends to activate the accumulated confidence exactly when it's needed most, rather than leaving it as a passive resource only consulted after the fact, once the moment requiring it has already passed. Confidence built this way, slowly, specifically, and honestly, rarely announces itself dramatically. It shows up quietly, in a slightly steadier voice during a difficult conversation, in a slightly faster recovery after an awkward moment, in a slightly reduced need to check how something landed before deciding how you feel about it. These small shifts, easy to miss individually, are exactly what accumulated evidence looks like in practice, and exactly what separates confidence built to last from confidence that depends on constant, external reinforcement to survive. It's worth remembering, too, that setbacks in this specific area don't erase the evidence already gathered. A single moment of old pattern approval seeking, even after weeks of genuine progress, doesn't reset the account back to zero. It's simply one entry among many, weighed against a considerably larger body of proof that already exists. Treating an occasional lapse as catastrophic, rather than as one data point within a much longer trend, is itself a version of the all-or-nothing thinking this entire practice is designed to move away from. Chapter 9. Protect your energy from chronic critics. Certain people in every life seem to specialize in criticism, finding fault regardless of the actual quality of whatever is being evaluated. Recognizing this pattern is essential because a mind still seeking universal approval will keep returning to these people for validation that was, quite simply, never going to arrive, regardless of how much effort or improvement gets offered in pursuit of it. A chronic critic's disapproval is rarely a reliable signal about the actual quality of what you did. It's far more often a reflection of that person's general disposition, one that would find fault with almost anything presented to them, regardless of its merit. Recognizing this pattern doesn't mean dismissing every piece of criticism from that person automatically. It means recognizing that their approval was never a fair or achievable target in the first place, which means chasing it is a guaranteed way to exhaust yourself for a reward that was structurally unavailable from the start. Protecting your energy here means consciously lowering the weight assigned to a chronic critic's reaction, not out of spite, but out of accuracy. Their disapproval reflects their pattern, not necessarily your performance. Redirecting the energy you would have spent chasing their approval toward people whose feedback is actually calibrated, fair, and genuinely useful is one of the most efficient trades available to anyone trying to stop seeking approval indiscriminately from everyone in their life. It helps to identify the specific signature of a chronic critic, because this pattern is usually recognizable once you know what to look for. Chronic critics tend to find fault across a wide, almost suspiciously consistent range of unrelated situations, criticizing your career choices, your relationship decisions, your parenting, your appearance, your hobbies, with roughly the same intensity, regardless of the actual subject. This breadth is the telling detail. A specific, targeted criticism about one particular thing often deserves genuine consideration. A near-universal pattern of criticism across every unrelated domain of your life says considerably more about the critic's general disposition than it does about the actual quality of anything you've done. There's a particular trap worth naming directly, the belief that if you could just find the right response, the perfect explanation, the ideal version of yourself, a chronic critic would finally offer the approval you've been quietly working toward for years. This belief keeps people locked into exhausting, often decades-long campaigns, aimed at winning over someone whose disapproval was never actually about the specific things being criticized. Letting go of this campaign isn't giving up. It's recognizing, finally and clearly, that the goal itself was never actually achievable, and redirecting that same effort toward relationships and pursuits where genuine approval and support are actually available. This doesn't mean cutting every chronic critic out of your life entirely, which isn't always possible or even desirable, particularly with family members. It means adjusting your internal expectations to match reality, no longer treating their eventual approval as a milestone your peace of mind depends on reaching. You can continue a relationship with a chronic critic while simultaneously, internally, releasing the specific goal of earning their unqualified approval, and this internal release alone tends to reduce an enormous amount of ongoing emotional strain. There's a related pattern worth naming, the tendency to give a chronic critic's opinion disproportionate weight specifically because of a role they hold, a parent, a boss, a mentor, rather than because of the actual accuracy or fairness of what they say. Positional authority and accurate judgment are not the same thing, and conflating them keeps people chasing approval from individuals whose actual track record of fairness doesn't remotely justify the amount of emotional real estate they've been given. Evaluating a critic based on the actual quality and consistency of their feedback, rather than based purely on their title or role, helps correct this specific distortion. It also helps to develop a specific, calm, internal response for moments when a chronic critic's comment does land, since even with full awareness of the pattern, an occasional comment will still sting. Rather than either fully absorbing the comment or aggressively dismissing it, a useful middle response involves briefly acknowledging the sting that stung a little, and then consciously reminding yourself of the broader pattern. This is consistent with how this person responds to almost everything, not a specific, credible assessment of this particular situation. This two-step response, acknowledge then contextualize, tends to process the sting more completely than either suppression or full absorption would manage on their own. There's a related situation worth addressing directly: what to do when the chronic critic is someone you cannot simply distance yourself from, a parent you remain in contact with, a colleague you work alongside daily. In these cases, the internal work described throughout this chapter becomes even more essential, since the external circumstances can't be significantly changed. Adjusting expectations internally, releasing the specific goal of earning their approval while maintaining whatever level of contact circumstances require, allows you to remain functionally present in the relationship without continuing to bleed emotional energy, chasing an outcome that the relationship's entire history suggests was never actually going to arrive. It also helps to find deliberately at least 1 or 2 relationships where genuine, fair feedback is actually available, and to consciously direct more of your need for validation toward those specific relationships instead. This isn't about replacing one dependency with another. It's about recognizing that humans do generally benefit from some degree of external feedback and connection, and ensuring that need gets met through sources capable of actually meeting it fairly, rather than continuing to direct it toward a source that has demonstrated repeatedly that it isn't capable of offering that fairness. There's a closing thought worth carrying forward from this chapter specifically, that learning to recognize a chronic critic accurately is itself a form of self-respect in action. It means trusting your own accumulated observations over years of interaction, rather than continuing to hope, against considerable evidence, that this particular pattern might somehow be different this time. That trust in your own observation, applied consistently, protects an enormous amount of energy that can then be redirected toward relationships and pursuits genuinely capable of supporting the kind of growth this entire video has been describing. One last thought worth carrying forward from this chapter: protecting your energy from chronic critics isn't an act of bitterness or withdrawal. It's simply an act of accurate allocation, recognizing where genuine growth and connection are actually possible, and directing your limited time and emotional investment accordingly, rather than continuing to pour it into a pattern that history has already shown repeatedly and clearly will not change. That energy, once reclaimed, tends to find its way toward exactly the kind of relationships and pursuits this entire video has been building toward. Ones where genuine effort is met with genuine recognition, where honesty is met with respect rather than punishment, and where your own steady sense of worth no longer depends on winning over someone who was never actually going to offer it in the first place. Redirecting energy this way isn't a one-time decision made once and then forgotten. It's a recurring choice, revisited each time an old pattern tries to pull attention back toward chasing approval from a source that has already proven, through years of consistent evidence, that it isn't available. Each time that choice gets made consciously, toward relationships and pursuits that actually reciprocate genuine effort, the pull of the old pattern weakens just slightly further, until eventually it requires very little conscious effort at all to simply let it pass by unattended. Chapter 10. Become someone who doesn't need applause to act. The most respected, most consistently effective people in almost any field share a specific trait. They act because the action itself matters to them, not because an audience is present to validate it. Waiting for applause before acting keeps you dependent on an external trigger that isn't always going to show up. Acting because the work itself matters, regardless of who's watching or reacting, builds a kind of internal engine that doesn't stall out the moment the audience goes quiet. Practice this by choosing, deliberately, to do something well specifically when no one is watching or likely to notice. Complete a task thoroughly, even though a rushed version would go unnoticed. Speak honestly in a conversation with no witnesses to reward the honesty with visible approval. These unwitnessed choices build the exact muscle approval seeking has kept underdeveloped. The ability to act from internal standards rather than external audience. Think about how differently effort shows up depending on whether an audience is present. Many people work harder, speak more carefully, and behave more consistently when they know they're being observed, and quietly relax those same standards the moment observation disappears. This gap between witnessed and unwitnessed behavior reveals exactly how much of a person's standard is actually internal versus how much is simply performance calibrated for an audience. Closing this gap, narrowing the difference between how you act when watched and how you act when alone, is one of the clearest, most reliable markers of genuine, internally driven self-respect. This doesn't mean external recognition is inherently bad or should be actively avoided. Genuine appreciation and acknowledgement from others are meaningful parts of a full life. The shift being described here is about sequencing, doing the work because it matters to you first, with recognition, if it comes, arriving as a welcome addition rather than as the primary fuel the entire effort depended on to happen at all. When recognition becomes the primary fuel, the work becomes hostage to whether an audience happens to notice, which means it can be sabotaged entirely by something as simple as an audience that's too busy or too distracted to offer the applause you were quietly counting on. Building this internal engine starts with tracking, honestly, how often you complete a task fully versus how often you cut corners specifically, because you've calculated that no one will notice the difference. This isn't about becoming obsessively perfectionistic in every task, regardless of its importance. It's about noticing the specific moments where the deciding factor in your effort was visibility rather than actual value, and gradually shifting that internal calculation toward the value of the work itself, regardless of who happens to be watching it unfold. There's a particularly useful test worth applying regularly, asking yourself, would I still do this the same way if I knew absolutely no one would ever find out? This question cuts directly through performance and reveals what's actually driving a given action. If the honest answer is no, that's worth sitting with, not as a reason for harsh self-judgment, but as useful information about where external validation has quietly become the primary engine behind a specific behavior, rather than the behavior's own inherent value. This test also works in reverse, revealing situations where you're already operating from genuine internal standards without realizing it. Notice the tasks or commitments where you'd absolutely maintain the same quality and consistency even with zero recognition attached, hobbies pursued purely for enjoyment, private commitments to people you love, personal standards around honesty that hold regardless of whether anyone would ever know if you cut a corner. These existing pockets of internally driven behavior are proof that this capacity already exists within you. The work isn't building it from nothing. It's simply extending a capacity you already demonstrably have into areas of your life where external validation has, until now, been doing most of the driving instead. There's a broader cultural pattern worth naming here, that many modern environments, particularly online spaces, actively reward visible performance over quiet, unwitnessed competence, creating constant pressure to make effort visible rather than simply letting it exist for its own sake. Recognizing this external pressure for what it is, a structural feature of certain environments rather than a personal failing, makes it easier to consciously resist it, rather than unconsciously absorbing it as the only legitimate way to measure whether effort actually counts or matters. This doesn't mean visibility is inherently wrong or should always be avoided. Sharing genuine work, genuine progress, and genuine achievements with others can serve real, healthy purposes: connection, accountability, even legitimate celebration of effort well spent. The distinction worth holding on to is whether the visibility is a byproduct of work you do anyway, or whether the visibility has become the actual point, with the underlying work existing mainly as a vehicle for generating that visibility in the first place. There's a simple weekly practice worth adopting to reinforce this distinction, choosing at least one task each week to complete with full effort and quality, specifically without mentioning it to anyone or seeking any acknowledgement for it afterward. This deliberate practice of unwitnessed excellence, repeated consistently, builds exactly the kind of internal engine this chapter describes, proving to yourself, through direct experience rather than through any theoretical argument, that genuine satisfaction is available from the work itself, entirely separate from whatever recognition might or might not follow it. Chapter 11. Replace approval-seeking with self-approval rituals. Every habit that gets removed leaves a gap, and if that gap isn't filled deliberately, the old habit tends to quietly return. Approval-seeking is no exception. Simply trying to stop seeking approval without replacing it with something else often produces a strange, uncomfortable emptiness that eventually pulls a person right back into the old pattern out of sheer familiarity. Build a specific small ritual of self-approval to fill this gap. At the end of each day, before seeking any outside feedback about how the day went, ask yourself directly, what did I do today that I'm genuinely proud of, regardless of whether anyone else noticed? Answer honestly, even if the answer is small. I handled a hard conversation calmly. I kept a promise to myself. I said what I actually thought instead of what was easiest. This small repeated practice trains your mind to generate its own approval first, before it ever looks outward for confirmation, gradually reversing years of the opposite habit. This practice works best when it's specific rather than vague. A general feeling of "I did okay today" doesn't build the same kind of internal evidence as a precise named moment, The specificity matters because a vague sense of having done fine is easy to dismiss or forget by the next morning. Say a specific named moment, "I stayed calm when my idea was challenged in the meeting," becomes a small, durable piece of evidence that can be recalled later, during a moment of doubt, with far more persuasive power than a vague, general impression ever could offer. There's a specific reason this ritual needs to happen before seeking outside feedback, not after. If you check outward first, asking "How did I do today?" to someone else before you formed your own honest answer, you train your mind to treat the outside answer as the real one, and your own internal assessment as secondary or irrelevant. Reversing this order, forming your own honest assessment first, then optionally comparing it to outside feedback afterward, protects the internal muscle this entire practice is designed to build. Over time, this ritual starts to change the felt experience of an ordinary day while it's still happening, not just in the reflection afterward. Knowing that you'll be asking yourself this question each evening creates a subtle background awareness throughout the day, a slight increase in attention paid to moments where you acted from genuine standards versus moments where you simply sought the easiest path to avoid friction. This awareness alone, even before any specific behavior changes, begins shifting the balance of the day toward more moments worth genuinely being proud of. There's a specific way this ritual tends to evolve over time that's worth anticipating in advance. In the early days, the exercise often feels forced or artificial, producing answers that feel thin or uncertain, a sign that the underlying muscle is still weak from years of disuse rather than genuine failure of the practice itself. With consistent repetition, usually within a few weeks, the answers tend to arrive more readily, more specifically, and with noticeably more genuine feeling behind them. This progression mirrors physical training closely, uncomfortable and unfamiliar at first, gradually becoming a natural, almost automatic part of how the mind processes an ordinary day. It's worth pairing this evening ritual with a brief morning counterpart, setting a simple, specific intention for one moment during the coming day, where you'll practice trusting your own judgment over seeking external confirmation. This doesn't need to be elaborate. It might be as simple as, "Today, I'll state my actual opinion in the team meeting instead of waiting to see what everyone else says first." Having this small, specific intention in mind before the day begins makes the moment considerably easier to recognize and act on when it actually arrives, rather than relying purely on in-the-moment willpower with no advance preparation at all. There's a specific benefit to writing these evening reflections down rather than simply thinking through them mentally, particularly during the early weeks of this practice. Written reflection tends to be more honest and more specific than mental reflection, partly because the act of writing forces a level of concrete detail that a passing mental thought can easily skip over. A physical or digital journal, even a few sentences a day, becomes a genuinely valuable resource over time, both for reinforcing the practice daily and for reviewing progress across weeks and months when motivation naturally dips. It's worth acknowledging that some days will produce very little to report, ordinary days where no clear moment of choosing self-trust over approval-seeking stood out. This isn't failure, it's simply an accurate reflection of an ordinary day, and forcing an exaggerated or invented answer to fill the gap would undermine the honesty this entire practice depends on. On these quieter days, it's enough to simply note that nothing significant came up, and to return to the practice again the next day, trusting that the meaningful moments will continue arriving with enough regularity to keep building the evidence this chapter describes. There's a final variation worth mentioning for anyone who finds the daily written format difficult to sustain long-term, a simplified weekly version instead, reflecting once at the end of each week, rather than every single day. This lower-frequency version sacrifices some of the immediacy of daily reflection while remaining considerably better than no reflection at all, and it may be a more realistic, sustainable starting point for anyone who knows, honestly, that a daily commitment is unlikely to survive contact with a genuinely busy life. Chapter 12. Live by your own standard, not the crowd's. Every chapter in this video points toward the same underlying shift, moving the authority over your own worth from outside sources back into your own hands, where it always should have lived. This doesn't mean becoming indifferent to other people, disconnected from feedback, or incapable of genuine humility. It means building a clear internal standard, one you actually respect, and measuring yourself against that standard first, before ever measuring yourself against the shifting, inconsistent opinions of a crowd that was never going to agree on anything unanimously anyway. Living by your own standard means occasionally disappointing people whose approval was never actually earned or deserved in the first place. It means stating a boundary without a defense attached. It means making a decision and letting it stand on its own, without needing a chorus of agreement before you're willing to trust it. None of this requires becoming cold or arrogant. It simply requires redirecting the same energy you used to spend chasing everyone's approval toward the much smaller, much more achievable task of respecting your own word, your own limits, and your own honest judgment consistently, one ordinary day at a time. This is where real, unshakable self-respect actually lives, not in a single dramatic transformation, but in the accumulated evidence of 1,000 small moments where you chose your own standard over the crowd's approval and discovered again and again that you were steadier standing on your own judgment than you ever were waiting anxiously for someone else's. It's worth being honest about something before closing this out. None of this means you'll never again feel the pull of wanting someone's approval. That pull is deeply human, and it likely won't disappear entirely no matter how much internal work you do. What changes is your relationship to that pull. Instead of automatically obeying it, reshaping your words, your decisions, and your boundaries around it, you learn to notice it, acknowledge it honestly, and then choose deliberately whether following it actually serves you in this specific situation or whether it's simply an old, familiar reflex asking to be indulged out of habit rather than genuine necessity. There will be moments where the old pattern wins, where you soften a boundary you didn't need to soften or over-explain a decision that needed no defense. This isn't evidence that the work has failed. It's evidence that you're human, practicing a genuinely difficult skill that took years of repetition to build in the first place, and that will take considerable repetition to meaningfully shift. What matters is the direction of the overall trend, not the perfection of any single moment along the way. Consider what becomes available on the other side of this shift, not a life free of disagreement or criticism, which isn't realistic for anyone, but a life where disagreement and criticism no longer carry the same power to destabilize your entire sense of self. Someone can disapprove of a choice you've made, and that disapproval can exist as simply one piece of information, weighed appropriately, without demanding an emergency response or an immediate change of course. This is what unshakable actually means in practice. Not immune to feedback, not indifferent to other people, but steady enough that a single gust of disapproval doesn't knock over a structure that's been built on years of your own accumulated evidence instead. That structure, built one small, kept promise, one calmly stated boundary, one honestly voiced preference at a time, is the entire point of everything covered here. It's not glamorous. It rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. But it is, brick by brick, exactly how real, lasting self-respect gets built, and exactly how you eventually become someone who no longer needs a room full of strangers to nod along before you're willing to trust your own reflection in the mirror. It's worth revisiting one final time the specific promise made at the start of this video that this shift doesn't require becoming cold, arrogant, or indifferent to the people around you. If anything, the opposite tends to happen over time. Relationships built on genuine honesty, where both people feel safe voicing real opinions and real boundaries, tend to run deeper and last longer than relationships maintained purely through constant accommodation and approval seeking on one side. The people worth keeping close in your life are, more often than not, considerably more interested in your honest presence than in a carefully managed performance designed purely to avoid their disapproval. There's a specific image worth holding onto as you move forward from this video, the image of someone who can sit calmly in a room full of disagreement, disappointment, or even outright disapproval, and remain fundamentally undisturbed, not because they've stopped caring about the people in that room, but because their sense of worth was never actually stored in that room to begin with. It was built, deliberately and patiently, somewhere far more stable, inside a track record of kept promises, honestly stated boundaries, and a growing willingness to trust their own judgment first, before ever needing to check anyone else's. That's the version of yourself this entire video has been pointing toward. Not someone who has stopped needing people, which would be its own kind of loss, but someone who has finally stopped needing everyone's permission to be exactly who they already are. If any part of this video resonated with you, consider sharing which chapter hit closest to home. And if you're still working through your own version of this pattern, know that the shift described here happens gradually, through repetition, not through a single moment of realization. Come back to whichever chapter feels most relevant whenever you need the reminder, and keep building that evidence, one kept promise, one honest boundary, one calm decision at a time.